barrier, our last market structures with our oligopoly today. And so remember we had this spectrum that we were thinking about of perfect competition at one end of the spectrum where we've got a homogeneous product, free entry and exit, thousands of sellers, right? So this idea of perfect competition versus monopoly where there's no competition. And really both of these two constructs don't exist in reality. Reality exists somewhere in the middle. And so in the middle we have the varying degrees of barriers to entry. We have varying degrees of numbers of sellers and stuff like that. So we take those three characteristics and we blend them. And so what I want to start off today is with our oligopoly, where we had a few firms acting strategically. So in your notes from yesterday, we had our three characteristics. They were, I feel like I just left off a few firms, didn't I? All right, so we got that. We went kind of in detail on the strategic stuff. So three characteristics of oligopoly. So the one we got stuck on, I guess, was the few firms. So we're going to build on that today. If we have a few firms and they try acting strategically or acting together is where we're going to start off today. So number two is that they can do a homogeneous or differentiated good. So we see few firms doing both of those things. So homogeneous good, a good example would be oil. So the world price of oil is dominated by OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. So they work together to try to influence the world price of oil. So we'll explore that a little bit more. Or something like T-Mobile, Sprint, and AT&T. Right? So we have a differentiated product, but there's still a few firms there, and so they might have to behave strategically in that environment as well. All right, and then a few firms, homogeneous product, and then we're going to have some barriers to entry. So that's kind of our basics that we're starting off with. And yesterday in your notes, I think I defined collusion, which is the idea of firms working together. And a cartel is a more formal agreement. So collusion is the idea of them colluding together, working together. And this is a more formal organization. So cartel is an organization of firms working together to gain monopoly type benefits. So they're going to maintain their independence. It's not like they're merging firms. So merging firms would be becoming one firm, but rather having a formal agreement. And so OPEC oil is probably one of the most famous ones, and it's mentioned in your book. Almost I think every economics textbook probably has it. So the OPEC oil cartel. And you can think of drug cartels, right? So they're organizations of maybe independent drug dealers that are kind of have a network of trying to gain power in the distribution of narcotics or something. All right, so here's kind of the mechanics behind that. So let's draw three graphs side by side. And in the graph to the far right here, we'll say kind of the world oil market. World oil market. And then I'm just going to pick off a couple members of the gang here. So we got little Kuwait, and we have Saudi Arabia. And then, so we've got the oil that Kuwait produces and the oil that Saudi Arabia produces, little q. So same construct we had before with, individual suppliers are then supplying the market over here. All right, so now each country that operates in the oil market would potentially have a different marginal cost curve. So Kuwait's might look like that, maybe Saudi Arabia's is kind of flatter like that. So we would add together their marginal cost curves to come up with the world supply. So the sum of the marginal cost curves, like we did before, ends up being the effective world supply, where that's dominated by these groups. And now we just kind of do a demand and marginal revenue curve. Marginal revenue being twice the slope of the demand curve. Line below it. So the graph to the right is the monopoly model, right? I mean, if you look at what we did with monopoly, that's all this is. There's the demand for oil in the world, and the supply, the marginal cost curve. We're going to act like a monopoly, and so the members of OPEC are going to maximize profits by restricting oil production to Q, and then the price of oil around the world, let's call it WP here. The world price of oil is that number. So WP equals the world price of oil. So maybe we're at $60 a gallon or something, or $60 a barrel. It's measured in barrels. All right, so now how do we figure out how to distribute that oil production? If this is 1,000 barrels here, let's just put a number, I guess. Let's put 100 just to keep things nice and easy. The OPEC organization is going to distribute that according to their marginal cost. And so Saudi Arabia, you get to produce 70 barrels, and Kuwait, you produce 30. Because that's how we constructed this thing in the first place, right? So we're allocating according to their cost. And remember, part of this cost comes from with oil production is how deep you have to drill. So imagine in Saudi Arabia, an oil-rich country, they just poke a little straw in the ground. Here's the ground, if this is grade, ground level, they just poke a little, they go 2 foot down and all of a sudden there's a geyser blowing oil here. Whereas in another country, maybe we have to go 100 feet down. And in the United States, we have to go even further. So the part of what drives the marginal cost of oil is how accessible it is in terms of depth and other circumstances. Bit of a simplification, but that's where these differing marginal cost curves could come from. All right, well now the good part for these countries is that if the marginal cost here is $20 and the world price is at 60, so there's the world price of oil, there's the marginal cost. They're able to enjoy this markup of price because the competitive price, remember, the economically efficient one would be where demand and marginal benefit, demand which is equal to marginal benefit and the marginal cost curve intersect each other. That would be here. So the world price of oil would be lower if the market was competitive. Right? Any questions so far on the setup? Yeah, Tim?
What is that sign?
Which?
WP oil.
WPO, and I should have put here, world price of oil.
Over the equal.
Oh, here? That was a dollar sign.
Ah.
Sorry, yeah, and I guess I was being a little sloppy, you guys. Make sure you put some dollar signs here so we know what's measured on the vertical axis. I probably didn't need to put the dollar sign. If I would have marked this, then we would have knew that that was dollars, right? So good catch, Tim. Yeah.
Is OPEC a good thing?
Well, let's analyze it and see what you think. So, everybody with me so far that working together, we don't get the competitive solution. Does that sound like a good thing?
Not good.
No, right? So, higher prices than what would be in a competitive market is the result. Now, the key aspect to this is the incentive system. So, under OPEC, this is kind of, I guess, the key part to this analysis. Under the OPEC cartel, what is the incentive for each country to maximize profits? So under this situation, incentives have been transformed a little bit. They're enjoying monopoly power, but yet, what's their incentive to do by each country, whether you're Kuwait or whether you're Saudi Arabia? Yeah, Tim? What's that?
To maximize profit.
Yes, they want to maximize profits, but this agreement that they have, the incentives are a little bit different than what we see under a private market without this agreement for each individual firm. So let's go to Kuwait for a second. What's the marginal cost of producing under the agreement? What's the marginal cost dollar-wise? What does it cost them to pull a barrel of oil out of the ground? $20. What can they sell a barrel of oil for? 60. So what's their incentive for them to do? Sell what? Sell a little bit more. They can't change the price, but what about the 31st barrel? How does the cost of the 31st barrel compare to the price that they're going to get, the revenue generated by the 31st barrel? Is that a good barrel to produce? Now, they'd be breaking their agreement, but how effective is the cartel at monitoring their production? So the incentive here is to cheat on the agreement. So under the OPEC cartel, what is the incentive for each country to maximize profits? Since the marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost of an additional barrel of oil, each country has incentive to cheat on the agreement. So we can kind of use economic analysis to say that there would be an incentive to cheat, and then we can go to the real world and see what's happened to OPEC over the years, and guess what the real world finds? They cheat. So they've been cheating on their agreement, and so the world price of oil isn't quite to the level that it would be. Now, I don't know today with today's technology, to be honest with you, if cheating is less because through technology it's a little easier to monitor maybe. But even so, it'd be pretty difficult if you think about all the oil wells and distribution and all of the factors that really go into getting oil to the market. There's probably room to kind of cheat the system a little bit. And so we've seen cheating go on, and so the world price of oil hasn't ever kept the dominance that would be expected. And then innovations, probably more so in horizontal drilling and fracking and other forms of energy, have been competition for the OPEC oil industry. And so this cartel has had some success, but it wasn't without some cheating going on. So let me make sure I've summarized this all right. So I wanted to show the example. So for example, in Kuwait, the marginal cost is 20 when producing 30. And the world price of oil is 60. So if we could kind of hide and produce 31 or 32 or 34, now if every country starts to cheat a little bit, then we could see that what's going to start to happen to the world price of oil? It's going to start to fall. So then we start to get the actual price falling and maybe approaching our competitive price anyway. Okay, questions or comments there? Yeah, Jesse?
I'm gonna ask, what are
Scratch? Oh, okay.
I just think, okay. What's like the incentive to not cheat?
Well,
Other than
okay,
price
so
falling. I mean,
yeah, so they want to come up with monitoring system. The incentive to not cheat is, let's make this drug cartel. What happens if you're caught cheating? You die, or your family dies, right? Even worse, that your 12-year-old and 13-year-old daughter and son die. So if you have an effective policing mechanism and monitoring system, it's kind of a carrot and stick problem, right? So the carrot is that I get higher prices than I would be having in a competitive market. That's the carrot. The stick would be some sort of retribution or penalty. OPEC can have some sort of penalty for cheating if they're caught cheating, that sort of thing. So that's how they would want to manage the incentive system. Yeah, Anthony.
Just for clarification, so you're saying when the marginal cost goes up, when they cheat a little bit, you're saying demand goes down?
What happens here is that at this price, which is reflecting the price being set at this quantity, as we cheat and move this way, price is going to come down. We're going to move along this demand curve. So it's like you can kind of think about it being an invisible marginal cost curve. The marginal cost curve actually just was still there. It's just that when we act as a monopoly, we can restrict it. Because if we go back to our competitive model, then this is the supply curve, right? And then we had firms that were price takers. Let me do that real quick for you, just to give you, I won't spend too much time, but remember this thing? And this is really the sum of the marginal cost curves. So this thing here, supply equals demand, gives us the equilibrium price. And the competitors, the representative firm, here's, the company sits over here, they are a price taker. And so their demand curve equals their marginal revenue curve. Right? So this is competition, where the price got set in the market. Here, this is barriers to entry, and firms working together to act as one can restrict the quantity and jack up the price. Okay, anything else? All right, so we've got kind of a fun way to model strategic behavior, and it is through what's called game theory. Now, I've never really liked the word game theory because it kind of, to me, is demeaning to the actual power of what we're going to do. So, game theory, or Russ's thing here might be the theory of strategic behavior. Doesn't that have a nice, more formal ring? Like we're really going to study something serious rather than Monopoly and chess and backgammon and checkers. But nonetheless, game theory. Game theory analyzes moves and counter moves of economic agents. Economic agents could be individuals, households, businesses, governments. I'll just put etc. Economic agents are people making decisions under some sort of constraint, right? Very general idea of some decision maker trying to do something. So it analyzes moves and counter moves of economic agents that are trying to maximize a payoff. And so a payoff could be utility, happiness that we talked about with consumers. A payoff could be profits of a firm. A payoff could be taxes for the government, maybe. Et cetera, et cetera. Whatever the objective function is, they're trying to maximize. If they're a politician, maybe it's to maximize votes, right? To maximize their budget. If they are if they're the Department of Defense, how can we get more dollars? So very general. All right, so I like to just kind of start this off with an example. Suppose Coke and Pepsi are trying to choose a high or low advertising budget. So Coke and Pepsi are trying to decide a high or low advertising budget. So one of the nice things about this is we're going to get away from supply and demand. So students usually kind of like this. We're going to have a little 4-square box called the payoff matrix. So in the payoff matrix, we've got Coke to the left, Pepsi to the right, each making a decision of whether to go high or low, high or low. And so yesterday I talked about the interdependence of firms, so that one firm's choice is going to have implications on another firm's outcomes, in this case profit. So if both Coke and Pepsi go with a high advertising budget, they both make $20 million. If they both cheap out and go with a low advertising budget, then Coke makes 50 million and Pepsi makes 50 million. So now, here's where it gets interesting is if Coke goes with hiring Patrick Mahomes to advertise, and Pepsi goes with the OU quarterback, then Coke makes 100 million and Pepsi makes nothing. Meanwhile, if Pepsi goes with Bruno Mars and Coke goes with Britney Spears, then Coke makes nothing and Pepsi makes 100 million. I don't know if Bruno Mars is in that much demand anymore or not. Maybe I should have picked a better pop star. Taylor Swift, duh. All right, I'm gonna scratch that. And Pepsi's going with Taylor Swift, and Coke is still with Britney Spears down here. So, okay. So, just to make sure everybody's clear then, how this new economic model works, right? We don't have supply and demand, but the economic agents are here. So these are the agents. High and low are their choices. And then within the cell of the matrix, the first entry is the agent to the left. So this is Coke's payoff. And the entry to the right is Pepsi's payoff. All right, so where do we end up? What's the equilibrium? Where do we end up? Where do you think we end up? What's the equilibrium? So the equilibrium, the general definition of equilibrium I like is a situation in which there's no tendency for change. Kind of a somewhat stable place to be. What would you do if you had to play the game? If you were Coke, you can kind of put on one hat or the other. Fernando, do you got your hand up or a stretch?
I'll say bottom right.
Bottom right, okay. And why do you say that?
Because it's even so high.
Yeah, even but higher, right? So this would definitely be a desirable outcome, certainly relative to this one, right? And so one of the things we need to do is kind of say, well, why wouldn't they get to that equilibrium? And so one of the important aspects of game theory is establishing the rules of the game. So what are the rules of the game? So rules of the game are important for the NFL. What's a penalty? What's not a penalty? It's important for business, right? What is legal to do? What's illegal to do? Can firms do price fixing and quantity fixing and work together? We went over yesterday that there's antitrust laws, so companies have to operate within some framework of rules to run a business in the United States. And so here with this game, one of the early important ones to establish is this a cooperative or non-cooperative game? And so cooperative means they can work together. Are they able to work together or are they not able to work together? Non-cooperative versus cooperative game. Since in the United States we have those laws that say they can't work together, at least under most circumstances, especially when it comes to price and other things. So we're going to say that this is a non-cooperative game. So since they can't work together, would we end up getting to this solution of 50-50 that I agree with Fernando that it looks like a nice solution for both companies. Yeah.
No, I don't think so, because Pepsi and Coke both think the other 50 is nice, but also 100 is nicer.
100 is nicer, yeah. So
if we get them to pay low from advertising, we can pay high for the money.
okay, so if we kind of go back to even that last thing on what's the incentives here? Is there an incentive if there was even an implied agreement, kind of a wink-wink like we talked about, a tacit agreement that's kind of implied between Coke and Pepsi? Is there incentive to cheat on it? Yeah, because 50 is greater than 100. Coke's saying I'm going to cheat, but now look at Pepsi. Do they have incentive to cheat? Yeah, they got incentive to cheat too. So if they're both not cooperating with each other, then would we end up here? Is that the best move, taking into consideration that possibility? So we kind of want to think about what's the best response, because it's non-cooperative, me not knowing for sure what the other agent's going to do, where do we think we'd end up? And so it seems like under that scenario, maybe we'd end up here with 20/20 and both of them going high. Okay, so how about if we play it a bunch of times? Would that matter? So one of the other rules that's important is whether this is a one-shot. That's literally what we call it in economics. It's called a one-shot game. We're going to play it one time and that's it, right? We're going to play it one time and that's it. Or a repeated game. And with a repeated game, we can play it a finite number of times. So let's play this game 100 times, right? Or if we were in business, we're going to play this for 5 years. Every month we're going to play it 60 times or something. Or if it's an infinite game, meaning there's no ending date. We might not play it for infinity, but I won't put infinite number. Infinite, no ending specified. No ending specified. So we call that an infinite game. So let's kind of think about if this is a repeated game that we're going to play 100 times. Do you think we might get to a different outcome playing it 100 times? Kind of seems like that would be a good idea. That hey, it's kind of like hey, I'll hire Brittany. If you go with the OU quarterback, wink, wink, or whatever, right? So maybe you would play a few times to see if the other person would play, right? And so yeah, we both start playing. We're both going to make a lot more money if we play it a repeated time, and maybe we won't lose too much money if it doesn't. So maybe we start doing that. But then Coke starts thinking, oh, I got an idea. On the 100th try, I'm going to screw Pepsi over, right? Because that's going to get me the 100. And then Pepsi starts thinking, oh, I bet Coke's thinking they're going to screw me on the 100th try. I'm going to screw him over on the 99th try. And then Coke starts thinking, I bet he's thinking that I'm thinking that he's thinking that he's going to do it, I'm going to do it on the 96, 95, 94, 93, and all of a sudden the logic unravels all the way back down to where we were with a one-shot game. So it still ends up being a better move in that regard with the cheating possibility, all the things we talked about, a better move to still play this, if that's the case.
Can they choose a high advertising budget every time though? Or is that number also a thing?
Yeah, every time they can choose it. Yeah, it would just be this is how much money they're spending, from time period to time period.
This reminds me of this game show where at the end these two people had to decide whether or not they were going to share something or steal it. And
Okay, split or steal, is it the golden balls by chance?
I think it probably is.
I don't know if we'll get a chance to watch that. I hope we can. Maybe watch that in class. But yes, that's a good one. So yeah, there's lots of different ways to set up the game, and the rules of the game matter. The last rule I wanted to see if what it makes a difference. And by the way, we're going to say this is a one-shot, non-cooperative. And the last thing is whether this is a simultaneous or sequential game. Simultaneous or sequential. So sequential would of course mean just taking turns. More importantly, what it means is, let's say Pepsi gets to go first and then Coke decides second, right? Knowing what Pepsi chose. So that's what a sequential game is. A simultaneous game does not have to be like rock, paper, scissors where we actually decide simultaneously, but more importantly, one agent is making their decision without knowledge of the other agent's choice, right? So they're effectively doing it simultaneously. So simultaneous is choice without knowledge of others' choice. So we go simultaneous or sequential. So let's look at this and let's pretend it is a sequential game for a moment. Pepsi gets to go first. If Pepsi goes first, do they have an advantage? Is there kind of a first mover advantage, right? In a lot of games, if you get to move first, then there can be an advantage to that. So is there a first mover advantage here? Let's pretend Pepsi gets to go first. What would you choose if you're Pepsi and you get to go first? High? Why high? Daniel?
Because if you pick low, Coke's just gonna pick high.
All right. Knowing that they're going to go first, that's what would be the result, right? So if you go low, like, hey, I went low, why don't you go low? Especially if it's a one-shot game, you're screwed for sure, right? That they would choose high. And so what we're using then is what's called backwards induction. So when we have especially a sequential game, taking turns, use backward induction as the technique to solve. And what that means is start at the end. And so we can have the luxury, since both agents see this thing, there's no uncertainty, right, with the way this is set up, is that Pepsi can say to themselves, if I go high, well then Coke is definitely going to choose high. If I go low, then Coke is definitely going to choose high. So Coke's going to choose high no matter what, kind of working backwards, right? Starting with Coke's choices. And so this isn't even really a possibility of me getting 100. I can eliminate those choices and say, what do I want, a 0 or a 20? Because I'm Pepsi and I get to go first, I would rather have a 20. So I'm going to choose high. So back to my initial question, is there a first mover advantage then for Pepsi? No, we end up at the same spot, right? We end up at the same spot whether some player goes first or not. Okay, so let's do a couple techniques here. Maybe I'll start over here so I'm not getting too crowded. Of how to solve the game. We've kind of done some of them, at least verbally. But there's a couple techniques that are good. So techniques for solving games. So number one, you can look for a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy, which is a choice that makes an agent better off no matter what the other chooses. So a dominant strategy is a choice that makes an agent better off no matter what the other chooses. So we kind of did this before a little bit. So for example, let's just retrace what we did for Pepsi. So dominant strategy for Pepsi, question mark. If Coke chooses high, then Pepsi should choose, let's go back over to the matrix now. If Coke chooses high, what should Pepsi choose? High, because 20 is greater than 0. So kind of similar to the analysis we did with the sequential game, but if Coke chooses high, then Pepsi should choose high. If Coke chooses low, then Pepsi should choose what? So now if Coke happened to choose low, what should Pepsi choose? High, because 100 is greater than 50. So we have to do a little bit of eyeball training is what I call it when we kind of are solving games here. So they would choose high. And then we have it. Since Pepsi has the best option of going high no matter what Coke chooses, Pepsi has a dominant strategy. So therefore, Pepsi has a dominant strategy of high. So once I find one player that has a dominant strategy of high, we could solve the game by then just saying, well, if Pepsi's for sure going high, what's Coke going to do? 20 versus 0, Coke's going to do high too, right? And you'd be done. But in fact, Coke has a dominant strategy as well. So let's go through that logic for Coke. If Pepsi chooses high, what should Coke do? Choose high, 20 is greater than 0. If Pepsi would happen to choose low, what should Coke do? Choose high. So Coke also has a dominant strategy of choosing high. All right, questions on that? The second technique is to look for an equilibrium called a Nash equilibrium. So number 2 is to look for a Nash equilibrium, which is a choice combination such that neither agent wants to change choice, taking as given the other's choice. Okay, so that's kind of a mouthful too. Nash equilibrium is a choice such that neither agent wants to change their mind, if you want to think of it that way. So with this technique, you can pick any of the solutions. Let's go back to Fernando's originally and how we'd analyze whether this 50-50, which looked appealing, is a Nash equilibrium. You just ask yourself, would Coke like to change its mind, taking as given that Pepsi's going low? Would Coke like to switch from 50? Yeah, because 100's better. So it's not a Nash equilibrium. Then if we can check this one, Coke wouldn't want to switch, but would Pepsi want to switch? Yes, because 20 is greater than 0. So that's not a Nash equilibrium. So now we're on to our Our one here, would Coke want to switch? No. Would Pepsi want to switch? No. So that is a Nash equilibrium. And so it's common that we put a little N up in the upper right-hand corner to signify that that's the Nash equilibrium. All right, so I want to end with a little video. The Nash equilibrium was named such after John Nash, a famous economist, mathematician that really was the most influential in developing this game theory. And so how many of you have seen A Beautiful Mind? A Beautiful Mind? So this is a clip from that. If you haven't seen it, it's good for the average person. It's a Hollywood production. Long story short, he starts going crazy like a lot of brilliant minds do. But this is the scene at the bar where he has his aha moment of game theory. John Nash is Russell Crowe. This is the geeky one here. This is John Nash.
Not by each other. Anyone else feels she's been moving in slow motion? Does she want a large wedding, you think?
Should we say swords, gentlemen? Pistols at dawn.
Have you remembered nothing? Recall the lessons of Adam Smith, the father of modern economics.
In competition, individual ambition serves the common good.
Exactly.
Every man for himself, gentlemen.
Yeah, those who strike out are stuck with their friends.
I'm not going to strike out.
You can lead a blonde to water, but you can't make a friend.
I don't think so.
Alright, nobody move. She's looking over there. She's looking at Nash.
Oh, God. All right, he may have the upper hand now, but wait until he opens his mouth.
Adam Smith needs for a picture.
What are you talking about?
If we don't go for the blonde. We block each other. Not a single one of us is going to get her. So then we go for her friends. But they will all give us the cold shoulder because nobody likes to be second choice. But what if no one goes for the blonde? We don't get in each other's way. And we don't insult the other girls. That's the only way we win. That's the only way we all get laid. Adam Smith said, best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself, right? That's what he said, that's right. Incomplete. Incomplete. Okay. Because the best result will come from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself and the group.
Nash, this is some way for you to get the blood on your own. You can go to hell.
Governing dynamics, Joe. Governing dynamics. Adam Smith.
What's wrong?
Thank you.
Cooperative or non-cooperative game? Cooperative, right? And so that's where kind of his breakthrough was from kind of some mainstream economics. This was in the 1950s. John Nash goes on to become a code breaker because he's like that type of genius, right? And so he also developed something for the Cold War, which was the war against us and who? Russia, USSR at the time. And the idea was, let's keep building up our military so that we can annihilate the world a couple times over. Which doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about it, but it was a game theory thing that if both parties could annihilate the world, none of them would annihilate the world. And so he kind of used a lot of his game theory logic to help the Cold War efforts at the time. So the movie gets into some of that as well. We'll see you tomorrow.